Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're going to be talking about an interesting rifle, or interesting family of rifles, which is the Colt SCAR entries. Now, we go back to the SCAR program back around 2004, was when SOCOM put out a solicitation for a new rifle for SOCOM use. At the time, they were using the standard M4 carbines, and the M4 carbines were not designed to do what they wanted them to do. The M4 carbine, as it was initially designed with a light profile barrel, was designed as a support weapon for somebody who needed more power than a pistol but couldn't carry a rifle, not for frontline troops, let alone special operations troops. So when SOCOM got a hold of them, they started using them in their tactics, and the guns had many problems, such as bolts breaking, such as barrels overheating, barrels bursting. The rifles were not designed to do that kind of work. Now, at the early time period, SOCOM went to Colt trying to make some modifications for their needs for their M4 rifle. At that time, it was the M4A1 carbine, which was a selective fire full auto. And Colt was not interested in making any changes because the M4 was a Colt TDP, or it was a government TDP, where it had to deliver them to the Army. Again, the Army was a procurement agency. It had to deliver them a certain way. So unless SOCOM came to the Army and the Army told Colt we needed to make the changes, that's the only way it was going to happen. It couldn't go from Colt right to SOCOM. So SOCOM was less than thrilled about that. They wanted their own weapon. They wanted one that they could be the project leader on, that they could make changes to at will, not have to ask the Green Machine for their permission. So hence comes the SCAR program. Now, there were several entries that went into the SCAR program, but there were basically only two finalists, the FN version and the Colt Type C version. So what we're going to talk about are the Colt entries. The Colt entries, again, there's only a few of them that were ever made. There were the ones that went over to the actual trials, which are the ones that I had a chance to take a look at. The versions that I looked at were actually guns that were used within the trials. They were quite heavily used at the time when I got my hands on them, but they were the actual guns. So let's talk about Colt's approach to it. Now, SOCOM was pretty much adamant that they wanted an external piston gun. They did not want an internal piston gun. For some reason, Colt had decided they were going to introduce two internal piston guns and one external piston gun. Even though it was known that wasn't what SOCOM wanted, they still did it. I can't really explain to you why. So let's talk about sort of the origins of the rifle. Colt was looking to develop a improved M4 upper receiver, and they were going off of a one-piece upper receiver design. The whole point of the one-piece upper receiver was to have a monolithic rail, continuous 1913 from front to rear, zero retention, a free-floated barrel, which was a major improvement over anything else that was out there at that time. The improved accuracy, improved heat dispersion, protected hands of the shooter, and not to mention with the more common in the global war on terror became this proliferation of force multipliers. You're adding lasers, you're adding cameras, you could be adding vertical pistol grips, you could be adding laser pointers, any type of different attachment could be on there. Now, when you put all that stuff on a RAS, again, the RAS attaches to the from the barrel nut right up to the front sight base. Well, what you're doing is you're creating a heat sink. So you have all the heat from the most hot part of the barrel, which is right behind the front sight base, that's going from the front sight base back into the aluminum receiver via the handguard to the barrel nut. So when it got hot enough, if you had a vertical pistol grip, you could bend that barrel down. When you bend the barrel down, that could be because of the softening of the aluminum, or it could be just the pressure that's on the barrel. That wasn't a good thing, and neither was its effect on the accuracy, the way that it trapped heat. So there were many reasons to want to go with the free-floating barrel. So basically what Colt did was they took it was a single block of aluminum, and they created a one-piece upper receiver. Now, this was done by two gentlemen at Colt, Paul Hochstreit and Art Daigle. These were the two pretty much the masterminds behind the Colt's one-piece upper receiver. Now, it had quad 1913 rails and a removable lower handguard. Now, this was sort of the interesting aspect of it. It was called a one-piece upper receiver, but Colt said, well, technically no, because you had a lower handguard that would remove. And the reason lower handguard would remove was so you could install the M203 grenade launcher. So that was the whole point. You still had a barrel nut in the rear that it would attach to, and of course it would still attach to the front of the barrel. So there was people who claimed, no, this is technically a two-piece, but one piece. So again, quad 1913 rails, And this upper receiver would be able to be a host to either an internal or an external piston, the way that it was designed. So the basis for the two models of the Type A, which was internal piston, and the Type C external piston were based off of this upper receiver. The barrel with 10.5 or a 14.5 inch, it was a heavier profile barrel. I would say it would be equivalent to the SOCOM barrel, if not maybe just a little bit heavier. So it was designed for what SOCOM needed for as far as heavy engagements, high volume of fire. Basically, you're probably looking at an easy 1,000 rounds, 900 to 1,000 rounds before this thing would actually blow or have a failure with it. It was designed for that really, really heavy duty use. Now, the barrel, again, was a standard 4150 chrome alloy vanadium barrel. It was chrome plated. It was what Colt was pretty much known for, just heavy duty. It had all three models had the Knights QD flash suppressor on there for the Knight suppressor. The front sight base on the versions was a relatively new one. However, it came out of the M16A2E1 program, which was basically Colt's first flat top upper receiver after the ACR. It was a folding front sight, and this pretty much mirrors what that was. The one that was used on the Type C and A SCAR were a little bit more durable, I would say, than the original one that they had. It was a little bit more refined, drilled and pinned. Of course, it did have a bayonet lug on it as well. So that was the basic host of it. So now let's talk about the lower receiver. The lower receiver was a standard M4 lower receiver. It would just drop on. The whole point that Colt took was that the SCAR or their improvements would be basically a drop-in upper that would go on any lower. For as far as the modularity aspect of it was concerned, Colt introduced two upper receivers. Again, a 10.5-inch CQB as well as a 14.5 standard carbine. Now, the lower receiver did have some interesting changes to it. And the first change that I thought was very interesting, and I can't really say as I liked it too much, was the selector. So basically, as you can see from the picture, you'll see how the selector is reversed. So it goes, say somehow it was all to the rear, and it goes up on that 90-degree angle. Now, when I first saw this, I saw this prior to it being released. And I went to Colt probably around 2004, doing some research for Black Rifle 2. Colt was working on this at the time. So General Keyes was, even though I had signed NDAs, he was still iffy whether he was going to let me take a look at it or not. So he sort of went back and forth until he finally told Michael Plant that, yeah, you can let him take a look at it. So they showed me this selector that they used. And I have to say, I thought that it was horrible. I mean, I thought that it was very uncomfortable to use, but SOCOM was asking for something a little bit different, so that's exactly what they gave them. So this was the most unique aspect of this lower receiver, was the change from the standard selector to this 90-degree one. The second major change, if you want to call it a major change, was to make it ambidextrous. They used a Norgon ambi-catch on the left-hand side, so you would be able to have a left-handed shooter. They kept with no right-handed bolt release. The bolt release remained on the left-hand side, so you could either use the bolt release on the left side or you could use a charging handle. That was basically the main change to the lower receiver. Now, depending on the model, for the most part, all of these guns utilized an H2 buffer, and that was necessary, one, because of the heavy barrel, and two, the external piston. So, again, if you had a standard M4 lower receiver from anything else that was out there, you just had to make sure you had an H2 buffer in it. You would be able to drop any one of these lower receivers on it. So the next thing I want to talk about is something else that was very revolutionary at the time, and that was the finish that was on these. Now, when you take a look at the rifles, one of the requirements that they had was all of these rifles had to be this new coyote tan or a flat dark earth color. Now, Colt chose to go with something that was called the CalGuard for a flat dark earth finish as per the requirement. However, there was a finish underneath that on the receivers, and a finish that was used on the metal parts that nobody had yet to see in the firearms industry. And that was referred to as nickel boron. And this was basically from a company called UCT Ultra Chemtech. Now, this nickel boron finish would eventually turn into the Fail Zero finish that we know of today. But at the time Colt looked at this, this was the first time nickel boron had been looked at for use in the firearms industry. And it was looked at a little bit differently than we're looking at it today. When Colt initially saw it, the corrosion properties on it were absolutely incredible. As you can imagine, for a SOCOM weapon, what they were looking for was something that was going to be able to handle being in handle being in salt water, with Navy SEALs, it would be in the most harsh environments possible and wanted it corrosion resistant. So Colt looked at this UCT Chemtech and the initial trials they ran on it. They not only they coated the upper receivers, lower receivers, the fire control groups, the bolts, the bolt carriers. Pretty much every part that was aluminum or metal was coated with this new finish. And it did give off a nickelish type finish on the steel parts. However, the aluminum required a finish that was on it. So getting back to the original testing that was done on it, it proved to be really, really incredible. And Colt decided we were going to go with this on the entire A, B, and C entries. We were going to go with the entire gun UCT coated, and then we were going to go with, and then the aluminum parts were going to have the CalGuard finish on them. So when you look at the bolt carrier groups, you would see the first time this nickel boron coat finish on it, which is very similar to what we see today. You saw that on the A, B, and C. We did see some spare parts that were put in some of these guns, though, that were manganese phosphate in the types A and B. But for the most parts, all the parts that were in there were this UCT color, this nickel boron color. And if you looked at the trigger components, which you'll see some of the pictures that we're going to be showing you, the hammer, trigger disconnector, selector, auto sear, all were this UCT coated finish. And that was something that was also very unique at the time as well for all three. And unfortunately, that would prove to be problematic later, which we're going to discuss. So let's start going into the actual guns that were introduced. First was the Type A. This was based off the one-piece upper receiver that was internal piston. It utilized a standard bolt carrier group that was nickel boron UCT finished. The stocks were all the Valtor EMOD, which Colt had found at the time was the most durable stock that they did with their drop testing. So that was standard on all the lower receivers as well. Now the Type A, it performed very, very well from everything that I had learned. However, it didn't perform to the point where they wanted with the external piston. The gun was accurate. It was reliable. It fulfilled the requirement, but however, the requirement they wanted was still external piston. So basically, if you look at the Types A and the Type C, they mirrored each other, except Type A was internal piston, Type C was external. So we're going to now talk about the really strange one. The really strange one was the Type B. That was the one when I looked at it, I sort of asked why. Basically what the Type B was a two-piece version of this where you had a standard M4 upper receiver, and the handguard that was used was the Arms SIR system, Type M, or Type Military. Now, you have to go back to this time period, again, 2004, where free-floated handguards were brand new to the market. This is where ARMS sort of led the charge with the SIR system, Selective Integrated Rail System. And basically what it did, it attached the handguard from the barrel nut to the upper receiver, and you had a removable lower handguard. Now, by today's terms, extremely bulky, extremely heavy. But again, you have to look at it back in that time, it was considered state-of-the-art. And it had an extension that was on the front of it as well to give you a little bit more real estate for mounting forward of the front sight base. This one used a standard carbine gas tube versus the Type A, which used a straight gas tube. Again, the straight gas tube was definitely an improvement because getting rid of those bends, it gets rid of those areas where the heat builds up. So your failures are far less likely at the higher temperature rates with a straight gas tube than they are with one of the ones that are curved like the standard M4 ones. So basically you had the SIR system attached to the barrel nut, then it was attached to the top of the rail of the M4 upper receiver, then you had the ARMS 40L backup sight on it. Now looking at this one and looking at the Type A, there was absolutely no benefits to the Type B. As I said, the fact that they introduced this, I had no idea. I can remember at the time I was at Colt doing Black Rifle 2 research. I remember Uncle Dick, or Dick Swan, he actually came in to meet with General Keyes at Colt at that time for a meeting on this Type B rifle. So again, looking at it, why? I have no idea. I have to say, in the people that I talked to who are involved in the testing, nobody ever really mentioned this one. We know that it was tested because of the condition of the rifle was when I got my hands on it. The rifle was definitely shot. It was definitely tested, but really had no idea of where this one would come from. So now we're going to look at the big one. This was Colt's Type C SCAR. Now, this is the one that literally gave the FN the run for its money, and many of the people who I've talked to who are involved in the testing phases claim that the Colt Type C SCAR did better than the FN variation. It was more durable, it was more reliable, and the accuracy was right up there as well. There's really not really too many benefits at all going with the FN. So let's talk about what the Type C was. The Type C was the exact same upper receiver utilizing a short stroke tappet piston system. Now, this was sort of an interesting way this piston system was designed too. Basically, you had a modified front sight base that was hollow in the front, and you had an operating rod spring, then you had an actual piston, and then you had the gas cylinder. So to install this into the rifle, you would insert the piston into the cylinder, the operating rod into the piston, and you would slide it in from the front of the front sight base. And once it was in place, you would take a drift pin and you would pound the drift pin in place, and that would lock your system in place. Now, this was one of the areas that SOCOM did not like about this because the gas system was not accessible for regular maintenance for routine cleaning. You literally would have to have an armor who would knock the pin out and remove everything. This is one of the lessons learned that would come out of eventually the LE 1020, which was an improved version of this. So you had a short stroke tappet piston system, and then you had a bolt carrier. Now the bolt carrier was a modified internal piston carrier with a steel insert. It basically looked like a carrier key that was cut down where it had the impact area where the operating rod would strike the impact area to drive the bolt carrier rearward. The bolt carrier was, of course, the UCT coated, standard bolt, standard cam pin, standard firing pin. It was all standard components. Now, one of the, if you want to see the beauties of what Colt did was they kept a lot of parts commonality with the standard M4. So, for instance, if you had a Type A, B, or C, and you had a bolt brake, you could grab a bolt from standard M4 stock, put it in there, and get it back into action. Forward assist broke, same forward assist. Any optics or any would fit. It's all interchangeable. Lower receiver, every single part's compatible, with the exception of having to have an H2 buffer. So the way this whole system was designed, it was a drop-in system that would use most of the parts that are still in the inventory. So the carrier was a little bit was very much on the interesting side. So these were the three entries that went in. Now, of course, the submissions go in at the time that the results came in. The FN and the Type C both were equivalent, if not, this Type C was a little bit better. So now, speaking to somebody who was heavily involved in the decision-making process at the time at Crane, gave me sort of the insight on what happened in that meeting. Looking at the test results, again, the Type C was on top. However, the decision became more of a political. First off, they felt that if they were to give SOCOM the Type C SCAR, it looks like an M4. It feels like an M4. A little bit more recoil, but it felt like an M4. So they felt that they would have been giving the operators the impression they were getting the exact same weapon, even though the weapon was completely different from the M4 carbine. They also looked at the SCAR, the FN Mark 16, the FN version, of course. It wasn't a Mark 16 until they type classified it. They felt that it was more modular, which we'll talk about in a minute. That it would be easier to upgrade, being more modern. It would have more options for upgrading, changing out barrels, barrel lengths, and other type things. They felt that there was more room for it to grow, and it was a newer platform. So the decision was made based off of the impressions that it was something that was more advanced and it would be able to be modified further. The FN was adopted. Now, if any of you have followed the SCAR program, you know that didn't go too well at all for the Mark 16. The Mark 16 ended up being dropped in favor of the new SOCOM M4A1 carbine, which utilized the new SOCOM developed, again, Crane developed heavy barrel. That was not a Colt developed barrel. That was by Colt. Once that barrel was put in place, and once the bolts were fixed by Colt, getting that quality control back up, there was literally nothing that the FN could do that the Colt M4A1 could not. Troops were already familiar with the M4A1. They liked it. It was easy to use. Parts were already in the inventory. There was absolutely no sense in going with it. Now, of course, as we know, the Mark 17, the 7.62 version, that would end up being adopted in limited numbers, and of course, that would have its fair share of problems as well. So Colt, when they got those back, I'd had the opportunity to go back to Colt on a different occasion, actually right before I went to work for them. And I got to take a look at all three of these guns to do articles for Small Arms Review and Small Arms Defense Journal on these. So I had got my hands on all three of them. Now, one of the things I had learned when I did that, I was back in the R&D area, and I saw a rack that had probably 5 or 6 of these SCAR type rifles on them, and they were blue. So, I had asked, what the hell are these things blue for? He goes, this is the reason why we're not going to use the UCT. When they did the salt bath treatments at Colt later, they had found that the salt bath was causing these things to turn blue. The upper receivers, lower receivers, the bolts, the bolt carriers, everything, which the initial trial didn't do, which is the ones that they had sent over to SOCOM. Now, the ones that came back from Crane, you'll see from the photographs, they did not have any blue on them. So these ones survived well in that limited test that they had done for as far as the salt bath testing. So that was one of the first things that we had seen when I got there. Took a look at the Type A. I have to say I really liked the Type A. The Type A would go on to become the LE6940, which we'll talk about that evolution as well. The thing, even after all the probably thousands and thousands of rounds that was shot through, I was still hitting the paper really well. It was still reliable. And then we got the Type B. Again, Type B just felt like I was firing a regular old M4 with a SIR system on it. I didn't really notice too much of a difference. Again, there was just not anything that really impressed me. But the one that I was interested in was the Type C. Now, because the Type C external piston was Colt's only second attempt in their history of trying to build an external piston gun. The first one was back in the 60s. It was the Colt Model 703. Now, if you look at the pictures of the 703, it has absolutely nothing in common with the Type C SCAR. They are both external piston guns, but the 703 was a long stroke piston, more like that of an AK, where you had a long stroke piston that it attached to the carrier. It was a much heavier and bulky type system. It never made it past a prototype because at the time this was developed, it was when you had the initial problems in Vietnam that were still being worked out for as far as understanding, the problems with the chrome-plated barrels, the lack of durability of parts because of the switch over to ball powder, of course the corroded chambers that cause those failures, and and parts breakage because of that higher cyclic rate. Once those problems got solved, the need for any external piston with 703 or anything else just disappeared. So Colt never bothered with it, and it really wasn't until the time the HK416 came out was HK was claiming that the M4 was fundamentally flawed and that the whole benefit, and they vastly improved on it with their 416. So the one that I was most interested in seeing was the Type C. So looking at it, it looked the same as the Type A. At the time, I wasn't able to take the gun apart. They still had some patents that they had for it. They still had some proprietary stuff, so they didn't want any photographs taken of it. I got to see the parts, but I wasn't able to photograph them at that time. You will see photographs now. This was taken much later, so you could actually see what the entire gas system looked like. I used to notice that the gun had a little bit more recoil. It had some modifications that were done to them. All these guns did. I mean, one of the issues that comes up a lot with the M4s is they're not over the beach compatible, meaning the way they tend to blow up when they get full of water. All of these guns, the barrels and chambers had modifications made so that wouldn't happen. These are things that Colt has offered the government in the past, but the Army has said we don't need it. There's a lot of updates that were done to it. But looking at the Type C SCAR, I could see how it was well liked. Decent cyclic rate, it was comfortable. It felt like a regular M4. It felt solid with that one-piece upper receiver. Again, the selector sucked on it. But Colt looked at that and they realized that they did have a product, and they did. So basically, they took the lessons learned from the Type A and the Type B to improve their one-piece upper receiver. And what came out of that was the LE6940 and then the LE1020. The 6940 was the Type A. Basically, the upper receiver was modified. It had some changes to the some of the the dimensions. It had some changes to the way that the slings attached. There was basically like a sling stud that was on the front of the handguard for each, which was something that nobody liked. They ended up going with more of the QD instead on the left and right hand side than on the bottom. 1913 rail. They made some modifications to the inside of the receiver as well that would make it acceptable to both internal and external piston. So that basically became the LE6940 or advanced Colt carbine. That would go on to be probably Colt's crown jewel they've ever had in this weapon system would be the ACC or LE6940. 10.3, 11.5, 14.5, 16-inch barrels. That would evolve into some other programs as well. Again, Type B, nothing. Type C went on to become the LE1020. Now, one of the most important things that Colt took away from SOCOM was they did not like the fact that the gas system was not accessible. So what Colt did was they replaced that roll pin or spring pin with a captive pin very similar to that of the front pivot pin or the rear takedown pin. Basically, it would pull out to detent and you'd be able to pull out the entire gas system from the front. So it made it much more easily accessible to clean and to maintain. The next thing was an improvement of the bolt carrier itself. Now, instead of having a screwed-in piece like the original one did, basically what they did was they took a key that looked very similar to that of a carrier key that was cut down about halfway, and they had a long stud that was on the bottom of that key, and there was a hole that made it up with on the carrier. So when you drop the key in, the hole would go into the carrier key, and you screw the two screws down, and then you had it. Now, the way that posted that went into that hole in that carrier was when the operating rod would strike that that key, the forces would not go on the carrier key screws. It would go on the actual carrier itself through that pin, and that would vastly increase the durability over the original Type C. Now that would eventually become changed to a one piece, which obviously was better. But this is just one of the integrations. So the next level that they went was with the operating system was the articulating link piston, which took care of some of the thermal heat and the way that expansion was and the way parts would move together. That was the next evolution of that. And again, the carrier would go through its evolution as well, and it would turn out to be later the advanced piston carbine. Again, I hated the fact that Colt came up with that APC or advanced piston carbine, or the LE6940P. Now, unfortunately, that gun was available. Again, you look at around 2004, 2005 was the Type C. And you look at the development of the LE1020 that went through, I'd probably say 2010, 2012. And then you had the final LE6940P. And I don't believe that it was probably until around 2013, 14, where Colt actually released that for sale. Now, the problem with that was HK had put up a lot of information saying that that was the best gun. You can't have it. That again, the gas system was fundamentally flawed. Colt had that option. They had that external piston rifle for any customer who wanted it. And there were customers who said that they would only accept tenders for external piston guns. And Colt, because of them being so vested in the M4, they did not want anything to compete with their M4 carbine. So they did not release their external piston gun. So basically what they did was all those contracts that they could have potentially had with their LE1020 or LE6940P or their APC, they gave to H&K, they gave to LWRC, they gave to other companies that were making external piston guns. And all that was because Colt felt that if they released their external piston gun, they would have been admitting that there was something better than what they had. And they would rather not admit that there were certain customers who wanted it and give it to them. They wanted to be right, and they just gave up that business. And it was a very poor business decision on Colt's part by not releasing that thing almost immediately because there were customers that wanted it. So there was very, very, very few of these Type Cs actually existed. Very few of any of the SCAR guns really existed. It was another one of those programs that Colt did some extremely great work, and it took a long time for the stuff to actually see market. The Colt one-piece upper receiver did not actually get released for sale until 2009. Now, again, you're looking at 2004, 2005 time period when the Type C SCAR was introduced. They had this upper receiver. So this was not released for sale really until 2009 with the introduction of the LE6940. And again, even like 3-4 years later before they released the external piston. Now, the one-piece upper receiver would prove to be problematic for Colt as well because they ended up getting hit with a lawsuit from LMT for patent infringement. Now, LMT had a patent for the one-piece upper receiver. Now, I can tell you because I know Art Daigle and I know Paul Hochstreit, there was no copying here. This was basically what we refer to as parallel development. There were two different concepts of one-piece upper receivers. Colt, from what they were doing, they developed a one-piece upper with a removable lower handguard. LMT developed a completely monolithic upper receiver with removable barrels. So I don't know whether this was a failure of Colt's lawyers being able to see what happened, or whether this was a an oversight, or well, there could be other things too. I don't want to really speculate on those. But let's talk about something else here with this. Now, Colt at that time could not go to court with LMT. There was no question. At that time, Colt was probably just around bankruptcy time. There was no way they could fight him. The lawyers basically conceded the fact that they didn't do their jobs, and Colt was forced to pay a penalty, and it was forced to pay royalties on all previous and all future one-piece upper receivers. So once this took place, Colt was a little bit less willing to sell the one-piece upper receiver. You started seeing more two-piece upper receivers. Colt wants to work with Centurion arms, so you saw a lot of the Centurion handguards being used. Colt at that time also was vested in the LE901, the 308 one-piece upper receiver too. When the Mark series came out, you saw them get away from the one-piece upper receiver and go towards the a two-piece to avoid that patent. So that was unfortunate that did happen, because really the Type A and really the Type C were really starting points for some of the Colt's really incredible programs. The only one that was able to succeed was the Type A, and that was because Colt actually produced it. Type C, and eventually the LE1020. The LE1020 never saw any sales. It wasn't until you got to the LE6940P, and then eventually the APC, they actually got some military contracts. They were very, very small. I believe there were some in Thailand, but there were some that were based off of it. So, they were certainly two really good starting points. But I have to say that I feel if you look at the entire M16 platform, Colt's crown jewel would be the LE6940, and in my opinion, an LE6940 with a 14.5-inch SOCOM barrel with a folding front sight. I think that was probably be the M16 M4's finest hour to this date. The only way you could probably improve on the LE6940 was to get rid of the 1913 rails on the sides and the bottom and go with an M-lock, which Colt very well may do that at some point, because that would be the next evolution, to bring this gun up into the modern age. But these are very interesting rifles. I was very fortunate to get a chance to take a look at them, before they went out a little bit, just to see what Colt was doing. Again, under NDA, couldn't talk about it. And then after it was all over with, General Keyes was gracious enough to let me do the reviews for Small Arms Review. Got to shoot the guns, and then eventually I would do more work on the history of Colt's external piston guns. I was able to look at the external piston system that the Type C used, then take a look at the evolution from to the 1020 to the APC to see that, because it's really interesting history. But it's an unfortunate Colt marketing failure that they really had some really incredible products that they just didn't put to market, or they did and then they quit. And I think that the external piston gun, I think the biggest problem with the external piston gun was it just came too late. By the time they finally introduced the APC for military sales, the 416 had already seen a significant amount of combat. The SIG 516 had seen a lot of combat. You had other guns like LWRC, even though they didn't see a lot of military contracts, these guns were already out there and they were being used. So it just came too late to the game, I think, for it to become popular. And you also have to understand too that around that early 2000s to mid 2000 to late 2010 or so, and then maybe a little bit into the earlier part of the 2012 2015, the external piston craze sort of just disappeared. It was really a big thing at that time. And then people started really realizing that it really wasn't that much of a benefit, and people started saying, what, I think we're going to stick with the internal piston, which I'd always agree with. There was very minimal things that the external piston can do better than the internal. Mainly it's down to your really, really short barrels. Once you get away from the really, really short barrels, there really isn't that much of a benefit. So I think that that decrease in demand for external pistons had a lot to do with it as well. But again, very interesting program. I hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you do, please click like, please subscribe, and even better, share. Thank you.